Join us for a Game All Night roundtable discussion of reviewers featuring Geoff Gambill, Matt Morgan, and Glenn Flaherty, and of course, myself, Chris Whipan, as host. Hello everybody and welcome to a new segment of Game All Night that we're going to be calling the Game All Night Roundtable. So what this is this is going to be a roundtable panel show where I invite some guests on and we discuss a topic that is relevant to the board game hobby at this moment in time. So this week I'll tell you about the topic. It's basically going to be the state of reviews. Are they necessary? What role do they play? A role of a review versus a criticism, and we're going to try and delve into that. And I tried to pick guests that represent an interesting swath of review pedigree. That's the word I'm looking for. A nice review pedigree that they have, and I thought that that would be a great place to start. So the man who actually got me onto this idea is live in studio. So Geoff, why don't you introduce yourself and tell the people where you're from?
Sure. I'm Geoff Gambill, formerly of the Longview podcast. This is a podcast that I ran for about 5 years. It was a podcast that was kind of all about taking a deeper, sort of a longer look at games. We would have guests on who were extremely familiar with the game, maybe had played it, depending on the type of game, anywhere between 20, 30, 50, 100 or more times. And having people talk about what makes the game so special to them, what they think makes it a game that has lasted and stood the test of time, and really trying to dive into it and look at it very closely. It would be very common for a show to be an hour or more talking about one game. So the Longview was really kind of dedicated to that kind of providing that kind of content to the community. And then as time went on, I was fortunate enough to be asked to do review work, which was, very helpful for me. And I started getting into reviews as well. And originally had them on as segments on the show towards the end. And then eventually they kind of morphed into what were called quick look episodes, which were dedicated to reviewing all of the review work that I had was kind of done on the quick looks episodes, and the long views were kind of kept separate. And so I ran that podcast for about 5 years, and was fortunate enough to be nominated for a Golden Geek for a couple of those years, which was a tremendous honor. It was really awesome because a lot of times with podcasting, you don't really know, is anybody really listening out there?
No, you do operate in a vacuum.
Is there,
that's for sure.
It's kind of like putting on a show with the curtain down and you think there's an audience out there, but you're not really sure. And you don't know how many people are out there. And you've got some basic metrics that you can use from, your streaming service or whatever. But it was, really nice to kind of watch the show grow. Had a really wonderful kind of dedicated audience that were regular listeners and contributors on the show. So that's kind of my story. After about 5 years, I decided to back out of it for reasons we'll discuss later.
Sure.
And I was really lucky to find a couple of guys who believed in the mission of the show. And so the show is actually still around and is still being put out on basically once every 2 weeks or once every month, a new episode. One just dropped about the game For the People. So, wonderful old Mark Herman game. So I'm really happy to see that the show is still continuing under T.C. Reed and Joe Sallin, who have continued it for me. So happy to see that happening. But I've kind of taken a step back for sure.
All right. So obviously the Longview is pertinent to you and your style. Mm-hmm. You like to be perfunctory and get it all out there, obviously. Then we go to Glenn Flaherty. Now, Glenn, you recently started working in board game media, correct?
Yeah, it's really not that long, and how it happened was quite accidental. Maybe, I want to say 3 years ago, I really started getting into it because I wanted to spend time with my wife and get her off the computer and spend time talking. And it was a lot of fun. So I wanted to make little videos to show my friends what the games were. And it really started as just a niche little thing for my my little community. And somehow it grew and I got people interested. Eventually, I was doing a segment on the Dice Tower podcast called The Sweet Spot, which I was trying to do like as a like a morning DJ zoo thing. That didn't go over too well, but I was on that, and then I started my channel called Board Games and Bourbon,
over well.
and that's been going well, and that's been growing. And actually, just recently, I had a conversation. I'm going to start doing videos on the Dice Tower again. So it has been a compact, short but wonderful little ride. And I guess really, if I had to think about what I'm trying to do, why am I doing it? Why do I feel like my voice is in there? Well, one was I want to be useful. I'm not really so much interested in being entertaining. I want to be useful. And part of what helps me be useful is when I do my reviews, I'm trying to do it in a very natural voice. In other words, it's not scripted. So there's a lot of ums and ahs and things like this. But for some reason, I find it much more able to digest when it's just in a natural flow. And I'm really making videos that I can absorb the best. And that's what I'm hopefully offering to other people that'll help them get into it.
Excellent. And I think that, fresh, young, non-scripted perspective is definitely a little counter to the long form that Geoff has. So, Matt, what's your story in all this?
Well, around 2009, I started out as a reviewer so I could get free stuff. And unlike Geoff, I'd say I lasted about 4 years and unfortunately did not win any Golden Geek Awards. Didn't even get nominated, but I believe someone may have tipped me 5 Geek Gold at one point in time. But I during those 4 years, I did have a couple paid review gigs. I wrote close to 100 board game reviews for MTV and Wired.
Oh, wow. Nice.
I then burnt out wildly on that whole experience, went back to writing as a hobby, writing more long-form content and things about the culture of the industry for dailyworkerplacement.com.
Okay.
And was keeping up with reviews a little bit on the side until I sort of officially retired about a year ago due to conflicts of interest because I have other jobs in the industry.
All right. So welcome back. You now know who we all are. So let's dive into this. And I think that the first part is what are the expectations? What is the consumer trying to get out of a review? What do you guys all think? Because I have imagined whoever's doing different shows has different opinions as to what maybe their viewership expects versus what maybe general populace, expects out of their reviews.
Well, I'll jump in there. And with my channel kind of grew out of very humble beginnings, and I started off with print and play games and roll and writes, and slowly got bigger and bigger from there. And I definitely think when they're coming to my channel, if anyone is coming to my channel,
right,
what they're really looking for is an honest point of view. They're not looking for me to entertain them or anything like that. They're looking, and they're not, and when I say useful, they're not looking for me to say, oh, this game is the best thing you'll ever have. It's going to stay in my collection. I think that totally doesn't matter. Just tell me, what's going on. Okay, it is good. Why are you saying it's good? What does good mean? What are those definitions by you? And I think, hopefully, I'm providing that. That's what I think they're getting from me.
Okay, cool.
I'd say it definitely is a matter of just wanting to know, is this product or game, is it worth my time or not? No, don't beat around the bush. Certainly you have to explain your views, and it might take a couple of reviews, reading of that person or watching or listening to get acclimated to their taste. But you want someone who is going to cut to the chase and tell you, did they enjoy this or not? And to present their own point of view on it, say, I don't think this is good, or I do think this is very good. And I also don't get hung up on driving people's purchases. A lot of times people aren't coming to a review trying to spend a buck or not. They just really want to know the quality of the product. That might lead them to say, I'm going to go try to demo it at a con, or I'm going to go try to play it at my friend's house. You don't have to put that pressure on yourself to say, am I convincing people to spend money that maybe they should or shouldn't.
Sure. Makes
I
sense.
think that's true of my watching of videos too. I don't think I watch a lot of videos because I'm interested in buying the game necessarily. I'm just curious about the game.
Okay.
And another thing in those reviews that are really helpful, that hopefully I enjoy when I see other people doing it, that hopefully is benefiting other people, is when I talk about a game, I actually talk about it in context of other games. And I'll give you an example. There's a game I was just talking about called 30 Rails. And the best way to describe it was to compare it to things already out there, steamrollers and these other touchstones that
Okay.
maybe you can relate to and make it a little bit more easily, grabbable and graspable for you.
Okay.
I think that's a totally valid approach. It certainly isn't for every member of the potential audience, and you might exclude an awful lot of people, but I think there's a lot of worth in having a specific range of audience. You certainly can't please everyone. That's why there is room for a whole host of different reviewers of different types and styles.
Sure.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to be said for that, because I've often tried to do the same thing that you have, Glenn, which is kind of trying to give some context with other games when I'm talking about a game, but that can sometimes work against you, almost like, insider baseball.
Right.
That, well, if I don't know what those other games are, that's not really helpful to me. But I will say that I completely agree with Glenn, this idea of, I think everybody wants to try to be useful in some way.
Okay.
I think being entertaining can be useful, in this day and age. People have a lot of stress in their lives, and if you can be entertaining while you're giving information, then awesome, bully for you. But not everybody is, kind of wired that way. I know
Right.
I'm not really wired that way. Yeah. But I think we all want to be useful in some way or another. And I really I want to kind of piggyback on what Matt said, because I kind of feel that was a primary kind of drive for me, which is that a lot of people out there are just like me, where time is a very, very valuable commodity. There's a lot of us don't have a lot of time. And so I think that the best thing that a board game review can do is let somebody know, as Matt said, is this worth my time? Because if I've, got 5 games that I can choose from, and Lord knows nowadays you probably have a lot more than 5 games to choose from
True.
on a game night, how do you make the decision on what you're going to play? And a lot of times that can be dependent on player count, complexity, things like that. But it can also just be, I want to play all these.
Right.
But which one do I have the sense is going to give me the best experience for the time that I'm going to invest in it? And so I think because time is a precious thing to a lot of people, that's probably the best thing that a board game reviewer can do, is let somebody know whether or not this is worth their time. That being said, it's really difficult because what I view as a waste of time might not be what you view as a waste of time.
Very true.
And so then we get into this really weird area when it comes to reviews, whether it's reviews of movies, whether it's reviews of board games, pieces of literature. What I might consider to be a piece of fluff that isn't worth my time, someone else might just love.
Right.
And so it's a tricky spot to be in as a reviewer, because you don't want to be dismissive of what someone is trying to accomplish. And so one of the things that I really try to look at when I'm reviewing something, I'd be curious what you guys think about this, is the idea of what do I think the designer intended to do? What were they trying to do? Were they trying to make a really light, fun family game? Were they trying to make a heavy strategy game? Because once I kind of know what the designer's goal was, I think I have a better idea of how to judge it from my experience. Maybe not from yours, but from my experience.
Okay.
So I can look at a really light game like Fuji Flush, all right, and review it. Or I can look at a really heavy game like Arkwright and review it. But I'm not going to go into the review thinking that Fuji Flush and Arkwright, I'm not trying to compare the two. They're two completely different things. Would you guys say that that's true, that the sort of the intent of the designer is important?
Absolutely.
Okay. So that leads me to, no, it's good. It's
Well, I'll, if I may.
sure, please.
I do think it matters, but I kind of have like this mix of thoughts on that topic, which is, in one way, I many times I play game. Like when I'm reviewing a game, I actually play it many times, especially if I don't like it or I think I'm doing something wrong, because I want to make sure I'm not doing something wrong, and I want to make sure that's why I don't like it. And what is the intent of the creator? How much, when I get the game, is the game me experiencing what the creator made, or is however I'm doing it and interpreting that rule is ultimately, if I'm having fun, I'm playing it right, whether that was the intended experience or not. That's one way that I look at that.
Right.
You know,
No, it makes a lot of sense though, because you care more about the result than the journey, and you're saying that you like you're just as interested as the journey to the final product as well, though.
Nah, that's not really what I'm trying to drive at. What I'm trying to drive at is that I've seen too many reviews where people will have a negative opinion of a game or dismissive of a game because they feel that it is lacking in some way.
Okay.
There's not enough paths to victory, or there's not enough depth here, or the replayability after 20 plays is, it's out the window, and then I have to kind of take a step back and say, but what was the intent of the designer? Was the designer attempting to make a game
that's an evergreen,
that was infinitely replayable, right? With enough input variability so that the game would never grow scripted, right, in any way. Because if that was their intent and they failed, that's a problem. If their intent was to make a game like Uno, okay, and the game, like Glenn says, I understand the rules, I'm playing it right, and I might hate the game Uno, but I have to take into consideration that what the designer was trying to accomplish was different than maybe what my personal taste might be looking for. Okay. And so I think as a reviewer, you have this really weird kind of place where you are kind of, all reviews are subjective, okay, to one extent or another, all right? I don't think there's any way to get around that, okay? Because I can't tell you that objectively this game that uses worker placement is better than this game objectively. I can tell you subjectively that I think it's better. There are
no objective reviews. I think we're all on board.
Right.
I'll hang up the mic if we get into that one.
So, since it's all subjective, obviously my biases and my opinions and things like that, they're going to enter into my opinion of the game, right? But I found it to be very valuable to always try to keep in mind that I have to look at what the designer was intending to do.
Okay.
Because I think if you get to that point where you start to be hypercritical of games that you consider to be too light, too simple, that kind of starts to move into that sort of board game snobbery, that can pop up is like, well, this game is, there's no meat here. It's like, okay, well, if there's supposed to be meat, if I'm supposed to be getting a steak, and I get a Brussels sprout, that's a problem. If I'm supposed to be getting a steak and I get a steak, then chances are I'm going to be, happy, but maybe it's not cooked exactly right. So this is kind of maybe a tortured metaphor, but I think you see what I'm trying to drive at here. So I think you have to take
with
that.
The counterpoint. Just to say, I think it's probably in every reviewer's best interest to develop a baseline criteria of what they're going to look for in games. If you're going to have 60 to 90 minute play time and some attempt at strategy, you're gonna expect it to at least have 15 to 20 plays before obvious strategies start coming to light, or whatever your bar is. You should set that and make it very clear to your audience, this is the sort of bar I'm putting this game against, and you should be reviewing things that attempt to come close to that bar. If you set that expectation, your audience begins to have an expectation of it, they kind of know your style, then you shouldn't pick up the sequel to Uno and say, oh, look, it's garbage, I'm going to throw it in the trash can now. Because everyone knows that's what you were going to say, and you're not really doing anyone any service.
It's not useful, right? Which it goes back to that word that Glenn threw out there that I like, that I'm going to keep hitting on, this idea of being useful, right?
Yeah.
So I hear what you're saying, Matt, but I think it's also a little bit, don't you think it's a little bit limiting to suggest that a person can only have one bar? I mean, I have multiple
absolutely
bars.
Not, because
you know what I mean?
I try to think of it as the assembling of a good board game collection. You want to have some heavier games, you want to have some lighter ones that, you bring out different types of games with different people. So if you reflect back on what type of game would I stock in my collection, you probably have a different bar for every different type of game.
Sure, right.
Whether it be your multiplayer, quick filler card game, or your, 2-hour heavy strategy game. You're going to have a different set of criteria, but you should only review things that on paper seem like they have a designer who's trying to approach your bar. Don't go out and buy LCR.
Well, then,
say,
isn't there a problem? Isn't there a little bit of a problem with that though? Because one of the things that I've noticed and that Chris brought up to me, which was a point that I thought was very well made, is that one of the reasons that there's not a lot of sort of critical reviews, right, or negative reviews, is because of that very thing, which is like, well, if I'm only ever playing things that I'm predisposed to like, right? Now, that could be very useful to people who have identified themselves as having similar tastes to me, right? But if I'm only ever playing things that I'm inclined to like, then I'm probably not going to be giving a lot of super negative reviews, which then can have this interesting bite back when people then will come back at you and say, well, you never say you don't, you never give a negative review. And so
I think that does come to light a lot with people who choose not to review games they don't like. But to shy away from that topic for just a moment, where I see the issue with complaints about not giving negative reviews, it's often because people are engaging in reviewing in all sorts of games from every single corner of the hobby, whether they're in their wheelhouse or not. And when they get into that behavior, they start to become afraid to throw down and say, this game is not very good. They instead will start to walk back their language, and you always hear, well, this is a game for this type of game. They'll imagine some imaginary person.
It's not a bad game.
No matter who they are. This is usually the moment where I start to veer off the side of the road. My insurance premium.
It's not you, it's me. I think that there's a problem with the "it's not you, it's me" problem, is that it holds somebody back from that critical point that they need to make, because either they don't want to maybe be a negative person, they don't want to tick off their audience, they don't want to tick off the publisher, or start any kind of those storms that could come from that. And I think that all those factors kind of play in to, the Dukes of Dice do this a lot, and they call it like Unleash the Two. Because what is a two? It's a game that they just don't like, and it doesn't belong anywhere, and they'll never play it again, which I think we can all say probably a third of the stuff we play might hit that, right? I think it's fair to say we totally play a lot of that stuff.
I don't know that it'd be that high, but yeah. I mean, there's definitely games that I've played that's like, this is a piece of junk.
Yeah, it's just totally not my taste. I never want to play it again. Well, then that's where it belongs for you. So how important is the voice of the reviewer then? How important is knowing the person who's doing the review and their personal taste? Like, I know Roger Ebert, whenever he says X about a movie, that I'm probably going to like it because he doesn't. Right?
Well, I think when you're cultivating your channel and you have this point of view and this reaction to the games that creates this thread through it, you do become trusted, even if all of your reviews are predominantly good. And as you're talking about that, I actually encountered that too. And I have kind of two situations about it. And thank goodness there are all these forums you can go in on Facebook or whatever and just ask questions. And I do this all the time because I will say, like you were saying, 30% of your games are just total garbage that you don't want to deal with. I would probably say that's probably true. I would say about 1/5 of the games I get, this is a hobby. I don't want to spend my time on the games that I know I'm not going to enjoy. My game group doesn't even want to get on the table. I just don't even spend time on them. And it has burned bridges with publishers because they say, I get these emails, hey, can I send your stuff? I said, well, send it and I'll take a look at it. And if I get to it, I do. And 20% of it just goes right in the donation pile or whatever. And talking about the positive and negative reviews, and you're talking about for this mythical group, this would be great, if you like broccoli or whatever your example was a second ago. Well, that's literally what it comes down to, because I think just the other day I was having this thought. I have a whole table of games behind me. And a lot of these games, if that was the only game you had, this would be the most fun game you have.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, but I'm not sure if that's what I should measure it against. So that kind of ties back into like when I compare 30 Rails to Steamrollers and Railroad Inc. or something like that. Do I say, is the game living by itself, or is it in the world of everything else? Do I say, you know what, if you have only 4 games, this is going to be in your top 3?
Right.
I don't know. That's a nifty thing. So I kind of got to go off the gut, but I definitely call the herd just to be games that I think, and hopefully I'm shining a light on the ones people will enjoy. But I've definitely gotten that criticism once or twice where like, you only have good reviews. Well, it's only good reviews because I've decided not to spend time on the ones I don't like.
Right. Yeah, Joel Eddy very famously has said a couple of times, I don't know, famously, Joel Eddy has said a couple times, I'm not going to waste the time that I have doing all of the work it takes to do a video about a game I hate. So he kind of came up with his idea of the blacklist, which he has as sort of a geek list, where the games that he really, really just did not care for, he periodically loads a bunch of them in there, you know, to kind of provide that, right? But I want to circle back to something that Glenn was talking about. I keep peeking back here, sorry. This is like Glenn. Yes,
fantastic.
It's Glenn. I want to kind of circle back, though, because he raised another point that was something that I kind of struggled with as a reviewer that I think is definitely something that's worth talking about, which is I kind of called it old gamer hat versus new gamer hat.
Okay.
Because, you know, you're exactly right. This idea of like there are many games that I've played, and what I kind of the phrase that I kind of coined for them was the dreaded 7. You know, like these are just it's a solid game.
Okay.
It's a good game. There's like 15 others just like it.
Yeah.
Now, if this was the first time,
probably not.
Right.
Does
If this
Rising
was-
Sun really beat Blood Rage for you?
Right,
is
or something like that.
do you
right.
consider them the same thing?
So I'm
Fair.
kind of looking at it as one of the difficulties that I always face as a reviewer is the notion that there are many games that I played in that sort of dreaded 7 kind of category, right? Where you would kind of take a look at it, and if I was approaching it as a new gamer, I would probably think it was one of the coolest games I had ever played, right? But as a person who's played 700 or however many ridiculous number of games that I've played at this point, right? I look at it and I can say, oh, yeah, you know, that was decent, but you know, it's kind of the same. So I guess what I'm driving at is, who am I reviewing for, right? Am I reviewing for other people just like me who have played 700 games? In which case, they're probably going to want to hear, you know what, good game, guys. You know, if you get a chance to play it, check it out. But it's almost the same as this, and this, and you don't really need to add it to your collection. Or
Listen,
am I talking
if they don't have any games here and they're going to like it just because it's their first game, then let them be steered toward the one that you truly are raving about. That is a true 10.
Okay,
I guess
but
too, in
all honesty,
watching
though,
these reviews, they're definitely deep in the hobby if they're watching anything we say.
Yeah, but I think that there's a curve there.
There is a curve.
Because I think you start out, like, I think when you first start, like, consuming the media, you go to Board Game Geek or you go to YouTube, and then all of a sudden I think your usage of these tools skyrockets. And you're on Board Game Geek every day, multiple times, right? But then I think it plateaus, and then I think it starts to trail off. And I think I've actually found myself not only culling my collection, but culling my inputs a little bit. Like, so I don't subscribe to every single new channel. I'm saying, you know what, this voice isn't for me, this one's going away. And I'm actually finding that my view is actually shrinking. So I think that there's actually a bell curve to it. Would you, like, Matt, you've been in this a while. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, certainly you need to seek out new voices and, broaden your range of opinions coming in. You can start to get into an echo chamber after a while.
Sure.
But going back to Jeff's point, I don't think any newer gamer is going to think less of the reviewer if they just say that, now, the 7, it's an okay game. You'll probably like it, but it's not lighting the world on fire. This even goes back to, not really driving people's purchasing decisions, but driving their time. That tells your established audience probably the most important thing. If someone comes at you with this game at a convention, you don't have to run away in fear.
Right.
You'll
Yeah.
probably survive the next 2 hours, and you'll go, I know, that was
So
that
so
was
it brings up the question: should you review every game like it's in a vacuum and it's by itself and it's its own singular entity, or should you review the whole collective? Should I review Star
Is it
Wars?
possible to do both?
Right? So when you go see a Star Wars film, do you compare that against all films? No, you compare that against the Star Wars films generally speaking. And you say, well, within the Star Wars universe, this sucked. But in regular movie terms, it was great because it's even better by
Jar Jar
standard.
wasn't good in any movie terms.
Yeah, and exactly.
That whole 1, 2, 3.
It throws off the bell curve, right? But you are putting that in context of all the Star Wars movies. So every deck builder ever made will always be compared to Dominion. It's the grandpappy, and Dominion
because
does
some
a
things are
wonderful
more
job.
powerful when they're novel, when they're hitting the table for the first
Right.
time. You're
Yes,
going to have an impressive factor, and you don't have to couch every review to say, if you haven't played a deck builder before, play this one. No, if they see deck builder, they're going to stumble. A new gamer is just going to stumble into deck building, and they will fall in love with the first one they play. There's nothing wrong with that.
No. So this kind of brings us to, I think, the next crux, which is, I think a lot of people view reviewers as needing to be critics. But I think that especially in our world, I think that there's a huge difference between what is a review and what is a critique. Now, I've seen people have started to change formulas, and they're trying to add some of that structure, Matt, that you were discussing earlier. They're trying to add, okay, well, we're always going to talk about theme, art, components. We're going to talk about gameplay, replayability. They're going to give you pros and cons. They're trying to structure. So I feel that the structure is trying to form, but I think ultimately, I don't think criticism can exist without the negative counterpoints that I wouldn't want to waste my time doing that movie either. That, like Joel says. So how big is that role gap, I guess, between review and critique? What do you guys think?
Well, the critique part of it really sounds like what you're asking is bringing an informed opinion. And I don't think critique necessarily means negative criticism. It can just have the background experience to put it in some form of context, and just to keep this on that one example that I keep using, like the 30 rails versus the steamrollers, which I keep harking back to just as a touchstone. When I was talking about it, I said, 30 rails is a print and play game. It's 70% of what Steamroller provides. And I'll use something like that. Now, is that a criticism? I guess it would depend on what you're bringing to the conversation, if you would see that as a downward criticism or just a factual criticism.
And that's fair. Absolutely. But are you able to say there's a criticism if everything you review is on a scale of 1 to 10, the bell curve basically goes like womp, and then it bows up at 6, 7, 8, and then goes down towards 10, right? And I think that if we looked at reviewers and looked at how they rated games, I think we could say that that's going to kind of trend out. And I think that that's a result. Like, if I'm a movie critic, I was just telling Jeff earlier, if I'm a movie critic, I can go see a movie and have my opinion in 2 hours, maybe 3. And I'm done. Maybe I'll go back and watch it a second time, and I'll have my opinion in 4 hours worth of work. But in some of the
reviewers,
games,
it takes 60 minutes to get the opinion out.
Right, exactly. And then now you have like arc rate. Let's take the biggest of the big. Each play is going to take that amount of time. And then the depth and the strategy now gets even further. So how deep does it have to go to be a criticism versus just a review versus just a first look? Because
The play time, how many times you're going to play at issue is just, you've hit on a couple different points of why getting critique and criticism, true critique and criticism, is the hardest possible thing for any content creator to do. I don't put shame on anyone if they fall short of that mark. It is really, really hard. Most of my reviews were probably garbage by my own standards. I'll totally admit that. But that's why you see a lot of other great styles of content creation. People doing playthroughs, people doing first impressions, people doing previews, things of that nature. And not everything has to be a review, but I would try to hold that in the canon to say, I'm not going to put my stamp on it and say, this is my review, unless I'm prepared to deliver actual thoughtful criticism and critique. Everything else is just impressions.
Yeah, I would probably agree with that. And the other thing I think it's important to throw out there that isn't always talked about is the fact that a lot of board game media content, although this is changing now, but a lot of board game media content, you're not getting paid for it.
No.
This is something you're doing for the love of the hobby because you like games, you like to talk about games, and you want to share your ideas about games.
Right.
And so I think sometimes the supposition that somehow I'm not meeting or you're not meeting or whoever isn't meeting their obligation for how many times they've played a game or whatever, it's like, dude, this is free. Like, if you want me to really dig into Arkwright, I'm going to have to play Arkwright probably, and I'm just guessing because I've only played it a few times, I'm probably going to have to play that game at least 10 times. At 3 to 4 hours of play, that's a full week's worth of work.
Right.
Right? And so I'm not getting paid. Now, maybe I got a review copy, right?
Right.
So that there's some monetary value to that,
Sure.
okay? But the fact of the matter is, it's still going to take an enormous amount of time for me to come up with the level of sort of criticism and the level of analysis that maybe people are looking for. But I think people need to take a little bit of a step back and ask themselves, who's creating the content? What's reasonable of me to expect of them, right?
Yeah.
Because there are people who are now kind of making this their job. Okay, whether we're talking about Tom Vassell, whether we're talking about Edward Euler, there are people who are kind of doing this now as their full-time gig, right? So those people, I kind of feel like it might be more fair to hold them to that standard, right?
Sure.
Because this is what they do, right?
Yeah.
Whereas I got a full-time job already.
Right.
And I'm doing, I'm playing board games, I'm reviewing board games because I love the hobby and I want to kind of let people know if I think a game is good or not or whatever, right? Something worth their valuable time. But you can't necessarily hold someone, I don't think, to that same kind of standard of almost professionalism when it's not something that they're doing for a living. And I think one of the things that may have been lost here is people talk about like Siskel and Ebert. You brought them up earlier. I grew up with those guys, right? But that was their gig.
Yep, right.
That was what they did. Like, that was their job. And so, I think when you're doing it kind of professionally, or if you're writing for a national magazine or something like that, right? Like in the case of video games, right?
Right.
Which is kind of where I'm suspecting board games are going. Okay, is that we're going to see more and more mainstream kind of attention, and the money the money that's kind of coming from the hobby as it grows is going to attract more sort of, I don't want to say, it's going to attract more traditional kinds of media attention, right?
I think that's
so fair. As that happens, then what happens to the people who have been kind of doing it for years? Like I think about Mark Johnson, right? I mean, he's been doing his podcast for like 20 years more, right? Garrett's Game and Geekiness, right? Doug and Shelley have been doing their podcast for at least I think 16 years, right? So these are people who've been doing this just for sort of the love of the games for as long as I can remember. So are people going to view their voices more credibly because they're not, it's not their profession, they're not getting paid? Or are they going to pay more attention to the people who this is their profession, and therefore we do trust them more because they're playing all these games more, and there's more of an expectation of professionalism, right? I don't know where we're going with that. And that's one of the things that I kind of wanted to talk about was, where do we see all this going? Does any of that make any sense?
It does. And I would actually put a lot of the expectations of reviews on the realistic expectations of the viewers themselves, because, I always consider my reviews outside of like the simplest and the moderate games where I can
Right.
feasibly get 10 plays in. And that's what I try to do. I try to get 10 plays in on a game, right? But you get these big ones like, Manhattan Project 2 or something like that. Man, I can't get in 20 plays of that. I'm sorry. I have things, there's a leak in the roof I got to take care of. Okay. And, but with a game like that, I moderate 3 groups on Facebook, and I have my own Twitter, and I did a survey. And I said, how many times do you really get in of a game? Great. Somebody wants 20 plays of Arkwright. And I put in, no one hardly broke 7 plays of a game.
Yeah.
So what are you looking for that
Right.
95% of people who own it haven't played it.
it's still in shrink wrap?
I own it. I've played it 3 times. So.
Why do you think the 10 by 10 challenge is so sought after every year, and how many people don't make it? Because especially with all this new stuff. But I think you brought up an interesting keyword that I think is the next thing, and I think it's trust in the reviewer. Just because a reviewer is paid, do they get more trust? Do you feel they should garner more trust?
I think a lot of times they don't get more trust. I think a lot of times if they're paid, they're viewed with intense suspicion, right?
Sure.
Okay.
It's almost like, oh, well, I don't know if this is really your opinion because you've been paid.
Real quick, define paid. Are we talking paid sponsorships, or are we talking like by the public paid? Because I think that they're different, right? Like the guy who just runs a Patreon account versus the guy who's sponsored by Joe Publishing Company. I think that's different and borderlines on conflict of interest sometimes.
Totally. And there's even the people who do, you're going to get a totally impartial review for me as long as you paid for that playthrough video. Wink, wink, wink.
Yeah. I hate the join. Yeah, you only get this if you get that.
Yeah, if you join,
we talked a bit about the people who are going full-time with it, and they do get more criticism simply because they're more visible. But at the same point, they have found their core audience, their base that is funding the bottom line. And those people do have the reasonable expectation. They know what to expect from this person's style, what their taste is, where they've set that bar. They're going to come in because they know what they're getting and they're already happy and paying. So while the people who are doing it full time do catch a lot of heat from time to time, it's heat that they don't really have to worry about. It's the people who are never going to pay them anyway.
That's fair.
Yeah. Okay. I see that point. At what point does it become a sort of echo chamber, though? Like when you have an audience that is so closely aligned with the content creator in terms of the style of games that they like, things like that. At what point are you making yourself less useful because you're only talking to a small group of people who are like-minded? Does any of that make any sense? That kind of goes back towards that elitism thing that I think is dangerous.
Small group. I think with the industry growing, that's why you see people segmenting off, because all of these small groups are becoming at least large subgroups.
Right.
That's true, because of the huge, just we talked about it earlier, the huge number of releases. I think there's over 500 at Essen this year.
Right.
And so maybe that segmentation, as Matt's saying, is kind of inevitable, because you're not going to be able to really talk about everything. I was talking to a friend of mine, and he was almost like wistfully talking about as little as 1995, 1996, before that, where he's like, there were 10 games a year that were coming out, and everybody was talking about them, and that's all they talked about. And the amount of sort of discussion, the amount of digging through the rule book and posting questions and giving opinions, I mean, there was so much focus on those 10 games that were going to be released that year, that I think people really could get a great sense of whether or not this was going to work for them, or if it wasn't going to work for them, whether it was in their wheelhouse or not in their wheelhouse, or whatever, right? Whereas now it's just overwhelming. Like there's way too much out there. It's one of the reasons I got out of it, because I could not keep up with it. It was insane. And so you have people who are looking for reviews of this game or that game. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? There's not enough hours in the day. I can't tell you.
I think that the
Specialization might have helped there.
Do you think that the amount of games coming out is counterbalanced by the amount of people offering opinions?
Well, it's definitely grown. I mean, for sure. I mean, like I said before, I think when I started podcasting, there's probably like 100 and some odd, active podcasts that when I looked on the Board Game Geek page, which ones were still active and producing. Yeah. And now it's a huge amount of content. And then, of course, you've got all the video content now.
Well, I agree with you, Glenn, and I think that that's important. But I think the flip side of that is there's still always this core set of games that is always the one that's discussed. Like if you go research one game that came out at Gen Con this year, you're going to get like the same 15 people talking about the same game. And I think that, the large outlets are generally the ones that are always talking about the big ones. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of those lower level games are getting overlooked. I don't think that, there are a lot more specialty producers, content producers like yourselves, like Danny and Derek, and other people who are trying to shine spotlights on individual places to carve out their own voices. And I think that and that goes back to Matt and saying that I think it's going to go more specialized. I think you need to have a focused beam and a focused voice in order to really kind of create your own market now. I don't think we're going to see the next Dice Tower network appear because I don't think there's anybody who's going to have that broad of a reach anymore.
That's interesting. Yeah, you could be right. Yeah.
It's just like, my background is music. It's the exact same thing. You used to have, 5 radio stations in your city, and you had 10 record labels. Well, now it is so compartmentalized and broken down, to the point where you don't even have the radio station, it's this specific stream on live stream or Spotify. So I totally agree that the ultra niche is where it's going. And lucky for me, like you were saying, my little niche is print and plays and roll and writes, which I love anyway. And luckily that's coming up a little bit right now, and that helps out. Is there going to be another Dice Tower? And, like we were talking like 200,000 subscribers? Probably not. How much room is there? But I think it's a great point that you brought up. I think the chase of viewers and the chase of hotness has 85% of the media covering like 5% of the games. There's so many that don't get love. And it hurts me because there's so many games that go under the radar and they get passed by. And to me, it really resonates with like a great record. I used to love having these records that were touchstones. Like we'd go to like the midnight release and we'd all get them. We'd be like, yeah, man, the new thing came out. and like now no one knows, oh, really? Who's that? I'll check it out someday,
Right.
It's nice having those.
Everything you guys have said is completely true. There's a mountain of games, and no reviewer community could tackle all of them. There needs to be. It seems like there's a ton of reviewers already. There needs to be more. I'd encourage anyone who's interested to, throw their hat in the ring, give it a shot. Take the sage-like advice that these 4 middle-aged white guys have provided.
Nice.
Go I don't think Glenn's as middle as the rest of us. He's the lower end of the bell curve.
Yeah.
Go forth and try to review these games. But Glenn, you're right on the money that, focusing on the smaller producers and publishers is the way to get started. Not only is it the right way to get started, but honestly, it's the hardest. You want to you're either going to bounce out of it. It's nothing wrong with saying you tried something and decided it wasn't for you. That's good on you for putting yourself out there. But to take on the hardest thing, which is, reviewing the small indie community, the low print run publishers. Frankly, a lot of those games probably lack a lot of polish and aren't up to the total potential they could have been. But there's a lot of gems hiding in those piles.
Totally.
If you've got the eye to find the gems and put them out there, you've done an incredible service, not only to the community who's going to get to play it, but you've given the designer and publisher the recognition they deserve.
That's awesome. That's a great view.
No, that's definitely true. And I think it seems like we're kind of coming to a little bit of a consensus, perhaps, that specialization is going to continue to grow. Because I think about listening to what Matt's saying and Glenn's saying, I'm thinking about things like low player count. Right, great little podcast that's about like solo games and 2-player games. Like that's their focus, right?
Yeah.
And then you have like Heavy Cardboard that is trying to focus on, sort of the meatier kind of games, right?
Right.
There are podcasts that are devoted exclusively to 18xx, right? So there's lots of war game content out there. So maybe specialization is the only defense that we have against the sort of avalanche of games that's coming, right? Because
and you were worried about the big mass market folks coming in too, to big name reviewers from other outlets. Those are never going to be specialized. Those are always going to be on deadline to review that same hot game that the other 85% of people are reviewing.
Right.
So that's where all the audience lies.
Right.
Now, how important? We kind of circled around the issue a little bit and we kind of stated it, but how important is reviewer transparency, do you feel, in this market? Because, we talked a little bit about, well, if a person sponsors a show or if they receive review copies, like Dice Tower will do a small little tag at the end of their verbal and say,
promotional considerations have been provided in the form of review copies of games.
Right.
Yeah, I've listened to enough of their episodes.
But do we think that should be like, should any of this factor in? Because I think there are the Matt Morgans of the world who just do this for the free stuff, right? But anyway, there's definitely the people who just run around Gen Con. Can I get a review copy? Can I get a review copy? And there's that person, who is doing that versus, say, the person who's genuinely trying to find things that fit their voice.
Well, I think that there's definitely, I think it's essential that you let people know if you've been paid for a review. It's essential to let people know if you've been given a review copy, right?
Yeah.
So every time I did a review, if I was provided a review copy, I said, be aware, I was provided a review copy of this game from such and such publisher.
Now, do you do that up front?
You do that up front. You do that up front because, and I would even say, so you keep that in mind in case that's something that you feel is important when you're thinking about a review, right?
Yeah, you definitely can't speak to value.
Right, which is my nice way of saying, if you think that's going to bias me, well, then you can either stop listening or you can take my review with a grain of salt. That's up to you. I'm still going to do the review,
right? But
I'm going to tell you that I got the game for free, right?
Yeah.
And I think that it's important to know because of what I said earlier. I'm going to circle back to that. I think sometimes there's too much of a stigma attached to getting review copies, okay? Because I've gotten plenty of review copies that I have either given somewhat harsh reviews to, or I have, done kind of like what Glenn said, which is, I don't enjoy crapping on somebody's dream, right? If somebody put
a good human
this
being.
is someone's baby, right? This is someone's baby. They thought it was awesome, right?
Right.
And so, I even went so far as to say to my audience, if you don't hear me talking about a game, that tells you something, And if you don't hear me, because I'm not going to go out of my way to trash somebody's creativity and their creation, right? Because, but at the same time, if you don't hear me talking about it, or if you ask me and I say, then no, then I probably didn't care for that game, right? Now, there are some publishers that I've worked with who have no problem with that. I have publishers that I've worked with who have come right out and said to me, hey, negative review, positive review, don't care because any kind of exposure is good exposure. Don't care. So if it gets people talking about the game, it's fine. You've done your job. Thank you, right? And then I've had other publishers where, and again, I don't want to say any names, where they would send me a review copy, and this one publisher in particular sent me a review copy, and I wrote them a very nice email saying, thank you so much for, the games that you sent. I'm planning on reviewing this one next week. This other game that you sent me, I've played this before. And I'm familiar with the game, hate it, despise this game. I said, so here's your options. I can send the game back to you. I can go ahead and do the review anyway, but I'm letting you know it's going to be harsh.
Okay.
Or I can forward it to another reviewer for you. If you'd like me to forward it to somebody else, fine.
Did you give me advice in a Facebook forum? Because that was the exact same advice I was given. I was like, that's great advice.
I might have. That's kind of been my standard, right? And so I've had publishers write back to me, thank you so much, and yes, we appreciate your honesty. Go ahead and do it. Or thank you so much. Yes, could you please, if you're already familiar with the game, could you forward it to this other reviewer? No problem, right? I mean, it's like $10, right? No big deal. I was getting the game for free anyway. But that particular publisher never answered the email and never answered another email I ever sent and dropped me like I was like dead, right? So
forget them.
It's kind of like one of those things where
but then
we try to, we're being transparent, we're letting people know, we're trying to work with the people, not trying to, be, and it's like, when the review copies come, I think sometimes people place too much of a sort of weight on that it's like, oh, well, you're getting a review copy. It's like, yeah, but I'm putting in all this work to do the review for you.
Okay.
So why is that such a problem? Why is it a problem if someone gets a review copy? Because as you said, over time, you're going to learn whether or not that person is trustworthy or not trustworthy.
Right.
Based on their body of work, right? Yep. So I guess I'm trying to make 2 points here, which is I think everybody has to approach their policies about reviewing themselves, but be real upfront about it with the audience. That's number one. And number two, I don't know that getting review copies should have necessarily the sort of stigma that's attached to it. Like there's almost this perception that people who don't accept review copies are somehow more pure, then like their opinion is worth more because they're not being polluted by the free games. And it's like, man, if you want me to talk about these games, I can't afford to buy all these games.
Right.
So if you want me to talk about them, if you value that service that I'm giving to you, then why should you care whether or not I'm getting something from a publisher? Right. Now, I can honestly say I never got any blowback like that, personally. But I've seen it happen to so many people. And so that's why I wanted to kind of bring it up, right?
Yeah. I think I can understand it to a degree, though, because, I'm at a point where when I get copies, and on my page you're saying about disclosure, one of my favorite tags on videos is when it says includes sponsored opinion or something like this. They tag on it like as if the whole thing isn't a sponsored opinion at that point. But when the games come in, I'm not sure if they come in like from a publisher or I bought them for a trade or I borrowed them. I literally, probably like a bunch of you guys, just have a huge stack of things I have to go through. So my little tags on my videos always say, just assume everything came from a publisher just to cover everything possible.
Right.
But I do understand the suspicion because I have that same suspicion when I am seeing some other reviewers, and I've even seen other reviewers who are buying subscriptions to their pages. Like, I was like, oh, this guy's on the same page reviewing. Yes. And I'm like, and you can tell. And like, I tell you, I should not turn my Twitter into a soapbox, but I do way too often. And I was like, this drives me insane because like there'll be this one guy who like all his videos have like 14 views and he has like 3,000 subscribers. I was like, what? How is that even possible? And
it's going to be obvious to everybody else, and their reviews are probably going to
no idea what they're talking about, which shows my age,
don't.
I think.
They're total yes men. They say the most glowing things about the most poo-poo platter game you have ever encountered, and it like blows my mind away. And it's gotten to the point where if a game shows up to me and I do have something good about it, even for my own credibility's sake, I don't want to be associated with those other reviewers. So like if I see like those other yes men reviewers are on a project, I will write them and say, hey man, I'm trying to separate myself from that crowd. I'm not even going to, include it for you.
Okay.
Yeah. So how about that?
Yeah. So we talked about a lot, and I think that we've kind of come up with a bunch of interesting opinions, and I'm find it very interesting that we are disparate on a bunch of things, but then we agree on a lot of the core things. So I think what do we feel should be kind of like a reviewer's operating code of ethics? Like what do we think that like I think everybody should have one. My channel has a mission statement that is kind of a directive about the content I'm going to create, how I'm going to create it, what kind, like, that I can drink on my sets, things like that. So what kind of things do we think reviewers at a minimum should do when they're reviewing games? Are they obligated to say how many times, what player counts? If I play 2-player games, Rahdo's great for me because, him and Jen line up a lot with my wife and I. Mm-hmm. But then again, that's definitely not for everybody. And also, do they need to discuss that?
Yeah, well, Chris, I think it's going to take the committee at least a year to develop the proper code here. But we could attempt it in one night. I'll key off of just one of the things you mentioned here. I mean, we have covered a lot of ground as far as what reviewers should do. Like I said, describe your audience, set your certain bar when to what Geoff was saying about what was the designer trying to do. There's a good give and take there between your review style and judging the product fairly. But as far as the how many times did you play it question, I don't think it's worth getting into disclosing how many times you played a game, because the appropriate number of plays is different for every single game that will come across your desk, and your audience will disagree with you just due to the law of numbers and averages. You're going to have more people disagreeing with you than is worth your time to get into that with them. And truthfully, a lot of people don't want to hear what goes into a lot of the reviewing of, more complex, longer games. If a reviewer is going to try to get a heavier game reviewed, they're probably going to sit it at their table. They're going to break it out solo. They're going to sit there and play through as all 4 players just to get the feel of it. Because like you said very early on, when you have a review crew that's coming in, they don't want you to constantly be subjecting them to garbage, and they want you to have the rules down pat. You're probably soloing it to try to figure out where the holes are in the strategy, so that when you have your 2, 3, 4 plays of a more complex game, you come in with an agenda to try to poke and prod at the rule set of this game to figure out if it's holding up or not, based on what you've theorized, from reading the rules and messing around with the pieces on the table. It takes a lot to generate a quality review, and it's not all I played it 10 times with the same group of people.
Right.
What about you, Glenn? What do you think you would like to see in, both as a person and as what you would watch?
Oh, man. Honestly, hearing all of you is making me rethink some of my... also making me rethink my purpose as a person. But,
wow. Breaking down walls.
Oh, no, this is getting real. But, I used to say to myself, and I based this on one time I was watching a review of a game I really, really enjoyed. And the person who played it doesn't discuss how many times they play a game. And I could tell from the review they did, I'm not even sure they read the rules themselves because they weren't even aware that there was variations in this particular game. And I was like, you played it maybe one time and did not read the rules yourself? How are you passing judgment? So I kind of made a self-promise to myself at that point that I was going to play all games, 10 times or something. But you are correct. Matt made a great point, man. There is a different amount you got to do. I can't play the massive games 10 times. I just don't have the time anymore. Especially
but if you didn't play Welcome to 10 times, you'd be remiss. Because you can knock it out in 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's right. And
given your focus, I think it is a good mark.
Yeah.
Yes. And as I've actually narrowed my focus, because I used to do a wider scope, but it's becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. So given that scope, yes, it is totally doable. But you're right. No one will ever be happy. No one will ever be happy with any of my reviews, as is often the case.
I will throw it out there. There are some games you could review by reading the rule book. And it's a narrow slice. If you want to review, Munchkin 7, these 30 cards that get added to the deck, you could shuffle them in and deal a couple hands at your table and be like, I kind of get what's happening here. I can assess the quality of this set of cards.
Yeah,
so there really are harsh ends of the spectrum there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So what would you want to see, Geoff? What would, you're out of the game. Well, he says he's out of the game, but he's leaving tomorrow to go do an episode.
Yeah, I'm doing an episode of my own show. How's that? I'm doing an episode of my own show. I would say, disclosure, right? Transparency, disclosure,
Okay.
And I used to disclose the number of plays, but like Matt said, I quickly learned that for some people, no number that I could throw out would be good enough.
Yeah.
Right?
No, I think that's
and
fair.
so I don't know that throwing a number out is really going to... I don't know that it's necessary, because I think, like Glenn just said, if you make a huge mistake about a rule in a game or something in the game flow, which I've seen happen many times, people are going to notice that.
And
right?
the bigger the game,
and
the bigger the chance.
And sometimes, sometimes it happens. Like it happened with me in the most embarrassing way possible with Terraforming Mars. There was a particular card in Terraforming Mars, and I actually worked on playtesting and working on that game. I probably played that game easily 100 times, okay? And I come to find out that there was one card that I was playing wrong for 100 times, right? Now, there'll be some people who would like hear that or see that and be like, oh, well, obviously he didn't play the game enough because he didn't understand that this card, you have to take all the plants that are lost from one player. You can't parse that out among multiple players. This guy's a fraud. And then there are other people who will be like, okay, yeah, I get that. I mean, things happen, right?
Right.
But if you're missing something fundamental about a game, that's going to kind of let your audience know that maybe you didn't do your due diligence, right? Because I can tell you just about every single game that I teach, I mess something up in that first playthrough. There's a rule I miss or something I miss, or I make assumptions now. Because I played so many games, I'll be reading through a rule book. I'll be like, oh yeah. That's just like this other game. And then later on, I'll understand, nah, it's really not, right?
Right.
So it often takes me a couple plays just to make sure I'm playing it right, okay? Once I'm sure I'm playing it right, then, again, depending on the game, like Matt said, it could be just a few plays or it could be a bunch of plays, right?
Okay.
And it all depends on the demands of the game. But I think as long as you're transparent about it, as long as you let people know, is this a game that you received as a review copy? Are you being paid for this content? Who's your sponsor? If my sponsor is, Tasty Minstrel Games, then I think it's fair for people to say, well, if your sponsor's Tasty Minstrel, I might question your 100% honesty about Tasty Minstrel reviews that you're doing because Tasty Minstrel's your sponsor, right?
Right.
But if my sponsor is Cool Stuff, right? Or in the case of my podcast, Game Surplus, that's a retailer, right? So they're not, it's not the same thing, right? It's not the same thing as a publisher. But if you have a publisher, you need to let people know, right? Garrett's Games and Geekiness, right? They tell you right up front, sponsored by Bezier Games, right? And they come right out and tell you, and they do their pitch for Bezier Games, right? That's part of their agreement. But if I'm looking to get a review of a Bezier game, I'm probably not going to go there and listen, right? I'm going to go somewhere else. And that's no knock on them. Right. That's just, I think, a natural thing that people would do. So I think as long as you're upfront with people,
okay,
I think you're in good shape, right?
Okay.
It's when you kind of get snagged, And there's been people that this has happened to. Again, I'm not here to call people out. But if you get snagged, then you have a serious problem, right? Because then people are going to question your credibility. They're going to question your integrity. So I think to avoid that,
it's not hard to be upfront and honest.
No, it's not.
You be honest and upfront with your disclosures, your involvement in the industry, and be honest and upfront in your analysis and impressions. Like we said, everyone's got their number. It should just be the number of times it took for you to get, a true, thoughtful analysis. And that's what all your audience can expect of you, is to be honest about your involvement, honest about whether you think you've fully come to understand the game. I mean, everybody's different. There are, a Mensa genius might be able to play Arkwright 3 times and find the optimal strategy where it takes all of us schlubs 10.
Right.
So
right.
if that's their skill, good on them.
I would say one other thing, though, now that I'm thinking about it, guys, I think something else that's really important if you're going to be trying to review a game is player count. I think that's more valuable than even how many times have you played the game.
No, that's.
I think it's like
true.
I've played it at 2-player, I've played it at 3-player, but I have not played it at 4-player. Or
especially if it's a podcast or video, it's more conversational, and you can really talk about the time you had playing with it. I think play count could definitely be disclosed there.
Because there are some games that if I played them 2-player, I love them. Like we were talking earlier, Chris, about Grand Austria Hotel. Love
Great
that game.
At 2.
Awesome at 2.
Don't
First
even
time
bring
I
it
played
near
it
me
was
at
at
4.
and I thought I was going to die, right? I
Yeah.
thought I was going to die of old age playing that game, right?
Yeah.
And I knew I liked it, but
And I
it was
perfect. Yeah.
terrible.
It's perfectly reasonable to say that you think you know how it's going to play at other player counts. I
Right.
suspect this game is not going to work well at 7. So I played it with 4, and it was
Right.
getting a
It's
bit
gonna
longer
bog
too.
down.
Right.
I think most people are pretty good about couching their language like that, and I'd say this game's gonna be garbage with 7, even though they haven't played it with 7 yet.
Absolute spurs.
So we do have a couple consistencies and credos to give to would-be reviewers out there, or people who care to listen to what some old hats and some young guard have to say. And I think that we were very clear on transparency no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to be upfront and honest, have a policy and make it available. Like, if you're going to say, like, I don't care how many plays it takes, we're going to play a game until we feel it's good. Or if your thing is playing it at all player counts, we're going to play it at that. Just be upfront. And I think that brings the last point, which is be consistent, with what you're doing. If you're going to say, Glenn, that I'm going to play every roll and write 10 times, that makes a lot of sense, because people want to know about replayability. Am I going to burn through 100 pages of steamrollers or not? Is it like 10 and I'm done? Like, throw this out.
Right.
That's a very important piece of information. So I think, like, whatever your structure is, and especially as we talk about as people specialize, I think you just need to be consistent, upfront, have a policy, have a document, and don't be afraid to change it. It's not set in stone. If you get to a point where 10's ridiculous, it really should be 15, or it should really be 5, adjust it, but be open, transparent, and upfront. I think that they're the kind of the keys.
Yeah.
But
I would throw out one more thing before we wrap up here, just to talk to the reviewing community, especially folks who are newer in it. Try to have some self-consciousness of not owing anybody anything else. You're doing this because it's fun and a hobby, or even if it's a job, you're barely making anything off of it.
Mm-hmm.
So you review in your own style and present the content the way you want to present it. This especially goes back to the concept of review copies. I made the joke up front. I got in it for the free stuff. And anyone who had that mindset coming in will quickly realize, oh God, review copies are a curse. If you may feel that you've turned the corner into the promised land when 3 reviewers have you on their send every single thing we publish to them list.
Mm-hmm.
But especially if it's your first time that happens to you, don't feel a sense of obligation to review every single thing that comes in the mail. Just because it got shipped to you, did you ask for this? Were they just sending it in the hopes of coverage? And I have talked to a lot of people who, that's how people get burnt out. They feel a sense of obligation. They say, oh no, I have 50 games now because they just keep coming in the mail because all of a sudden I've built an audience and I've turned that corner. No, you throw up the wall and review the games you want to review on your time, in your terms, because it's your turf.
That's an excellent point. And I just want to, because that is one of the things that burned me out, right? Was that feeling of, someone, sent me this product, they wanted me to review it or they wouldn't have sent it to me, so I should probably try to review it, right? I should probably try to keep up. And to kind of go back to what you were saying, Matt, people who get into this thinking I'm going to get all sorts of free stuff. First of all, it takes years before you start getting any free stuff. Okay, you have to have an audience. You have to have And nowadays, you got to have a large enough Twitter following or Instagram following. You have to, there's so much competition out there that publishers don't just give stuff to everybody, okay? So you have to be established first, which takes a lot of work, okay? But I love what Matt said, which is, if they send it to you blind, I wish he would have been there 4 or 5 years ago to tell me that. If they send it to you blind, don't feel obligated to review it.
Right.
But if you request it,
That's
or
a different
if someone
story.
says to you,
story.
would you like to have a copy of this game, for review, and you agree, then you do have an obligation. You do
Makes
have an
sense.
obligation to do something for that publisher who sent you the copy. You either have to review it, or, depending on what your policies are, you have to say, I played this game before, like the situation that I described earlier, right?
Set the expectations early so everyone's
Right.
on the same page.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
Right?
And then you don't have that.
Use your words.
Right.
Yep.
And you don't have the butt hurt when you tell somebody honestly, I don't like it.
Right.
Let
right.
me send it on.
And then the other thing, to be prepared for, if you think you're getting into it for all the cool free stuff, is the fact that the turnover rate in the industry is huge. And so you'll develop relationships with publishers, with certain people at publishers, and then they're gone.
Wow.
And they've taken another job. And then this new person's like, who are you? I
Right.
don't know you. I don't know anything about you.
Because they bring all their own people
Right.
with them.
So it's
Yeah.
it's a lot of work, which kind of goes back to the other thing that Matt said. I keep kind of referring to him, which is, remember,
You and Matt
you're
get
doing
along.
this for you. You're doing this for the love of the hobby, and because
Right.
you just want to share. You want to share. It's just like sitting around at a pub and having a few pints and talking about something that you love, whether it's football, or in our case it's board games, right? So just shooting the breeze, talking about board games. So don't worry about it maybe so much. And that was hard. That was a hard lesson for me to learn too. So I think there's value in what the guys are saying here, which is kind of have your style, what's your mission, set your policies, and just do it. And eventually,
Don't let those people get to you who say that you're just doing it for the games. They don't know.
they don't know.
what it's like. You get boxes every day and have
I
to
could
open
tell
them
you
up.
stories.
But they make more and more
I can
sense
tell
with
you
every
stories.
single Yingling.
In this case,
Yards.
Yards Tavern Ale. So, yes, they do.
All right, Glenn, is there any big takeaway that you kind of got out of this being, I mean, in this crowd, you're the new kid on the block with these two. So,
Oh man, you know what? Well, my big takeaway is have fun. That's why I did it anyway. It was my creative venue, and I love words and wordsmithing, and that was my joy of it. And it opened up. If you are going to do it, enjoy what you're doing. That exuberance comes through, and I think it brings like energy. And it actually opened up a lot of doors where I have so many friends now that I never thought. Like I'll tell you a great moment I had. There's a convention called Unpub. And I went there, and those guys are so wonderful. And they gave me a room to do my show from, and everyone was hanging out because I had the because I had the stag there, and the room. And like out of nowhere, Gil Hova comes down. He's super cool. And then like out of nowhere, Matt Leacock comes, and we just sat for like an hour just shooting the breeze. It was the most wonderful experience, and it all came through this medium that I didn't necessarily hold on a pedestal, but the joy of it, have the joy. It's infectious. It goes out and it reciprocates.
Absolutely. And I think that is probably the single best note to kind of wrap this up. I think, if it's something you love, just be upfront, put that out there, and just have a good time.
Have some fun with it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, guys, where can everybody find you? So, I mean, they're on my channel. They already found me, but where are they gonna find you these days, Mr. Geoff?
These days, you'll find me guesting on my own old podcast, right?
Okay.
You'll find me, I'm still on Board Game Geek. You'll find me, sometimes I go on Joe Salin's podcast that he does with Andrew Dennison and Trent Ham and T.C. Reed, The Good, the Board, and the Ugly, which is a fun podcast to listen to. And so, yeah, I mean, you'll still see me at conventions. You'll see me. I still do some kind of podcasting. I'm much more comfortable with podcasting than video. This is a step out of my comfort zone. Okay.
Well, thank you for that.
I'm more of an order kind of a guy. I like to talk. Yeah, I mean that's where you'll find me is there, and I would encourage anybody who hasn't heard of the Longview to go and check it out. They can check that out. It's on iTunes. It's thelongviewpodcast.com is the website.
Yep.
There's an archive of all the episodes that we've done. And if you're interested in hearing people talking about a single game for a long period of time and really dissecting it, then that's going to suit you fine. If not, then that's okay too.
Yeah, and you can check out my episode on Endeavor.
Yes. Yeah.
From that he actually dug up out of a deleted hard drive, so it was great. Thanks for that, Glenn. Where can people find you, sir?
Well, I do a lot of talking. It's where I talk to you mostly too on the Twitter at Games and Bourbon. That's my Twitter handle. Board Games and Bourbon is my YouTube page. I also have a bunch of Facebook groups. I have the Roll and Write group. I have the Print and Play group. I have the Board Games and Bourbon group. And then I also write for Casual Game Insider. I do a segment on a podcast called The Shuffle. And now my videos are going to start showing up on the Dice Tower. So there you go.
Awesome. Great.
Good stuff.
And Matt, so you actually do other things now outside of media, but you're a big dog now. Where can people find you?
Well, you got my Twitter handle right under my head there, so hopefully over the past hour you've either chosen to follow or block me. But I do still write. I'll give a plug for dailyworkreplacement.com. I write very sporadically, maybe 4 or 5 articles a year, but I try to write some longer form stuff, something more thoughtful or humorous, stretching my legs and not really reviewing anymore. Daily Work Replacement is the last bastion of the written word on the board game internet. All you podcast and YouTube people.
There's words. I have words.
We have words. I have all the best words.
But as far as my other involvement in the industry, I'm the tabletop gaming coordinator essentially for PAX East and PAX Unplugged. It's a job for me.
Nice.
All of our local con, aside from you Washington D.C. boy, you also have Washington. So you have a couple of.
Oh
ones.
Yeah. But PAX Unplugged, man, I'm so stoked about that.
It's gonna be awesome.
It was great last year. I was
stoked. It's gonna be big.
I was kind of expecting it to be like.
Oh no, that was Origin side.
Can you help me get my press passes for it? I submitted let's go.
Oh my goodness.
You know a guy now.
It was amazing. Like there were so many people there that first year.
Yeah.
And it was extremely well run, and really looking forward to seeing it grow into something special, especially because it's connected with Philadelphia, which is, kind of my stomping grounds. I grew up right outside of Philadelphia, and so anything Philadelphia, I'm down for. And
South Street.
Having that, absolutely. I mean, having that there is just fantastic. So absolutely love that. So. If you were working on that last year, Matt, that's awesome because it was great. It was a really good time. So
I think he liked it.
Work. Yeah. No, it was wonderful.
Yeah. I'll be hitting Game All Night for a future episode. I don't know, in a few weeks or so, and we'll talk a bit more long form on the topic. But a lot of fun things. Maybe I'll have something to announce. Maybe.
Nice. Awesome. That'll probably
be big.
You might be our first broadcasted in studio guest. I think is we're hoping.
You got Geoff Gambill right here, man.
But he's not going to do the show because we're doing this instead. So you'll actually get
he gets the couch.
Check them out at GameToppersLLC.com, upgrading your gaming experience. Well, that's a wrap. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed our efforts at comedy and fun, please support us on Podpledge. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And of course, don't forget to engage with us on Board Game Geek Guild 3134. You can also check us out on our website, GameAllNightShow.com. This show has been made possible through supporters like these. Angry Octopus.